bust down with some
We reject the ideology of globalism, and we embrace the doctrine of patriotism.
Not only will this tax plan pay for itself, but it will pay down debt.
There are moral and legal obligation questions that I think we'll have to wrestle with as a society.
When we as people go wobbly on the truth, we go wobbly on America.
All you have to do is look at the numbers, look at what we've done.
And this is only the beginning.
From 100.9 FM WXIR, this is Evidence of Design, and I'm your host, Jason Taylor. Evidence of Design is a live talk show about the political economy. We critique income and wealth inequality and support democratic values. Thank you for listening, and welcome. Good morning, everyone, on Saturday, April 6th, 2019 for episode 50 of Evidence of Design.
Hey, you got it right.
That's right. We are halfway to 100. That is how math works. Matt, I didn't think we'd ever get to episode 50, to be honest.
Yeah, I don't know why we're still here.
We're doing, in honor of episode 50, we're doing something special today. We're going to be talking about politics.
Wow, that's so different than usual.
On Evidence of Design, if you're new to the show, we basically critique income and wealth inequality, and we try to support democratic values and wonder about the things that we can do as a society to have a more, well, just society. So what can we do to make it so that the society we're living in is more just, particularly related to economic issues? That's what we do here at Evidence of Design, and thanks for being here with us. I'm your host, Jason Taylor, and you also just heard the voices of our good friends and co-hosts, Matt Treadwell.
It's me.
And Mary Lawrence.
That's me.
There are so many ways you can participate in this show. It's really quite amazing, Matt. Don't you agree?
Yeah. You
can mail in if you'd like, but not for now. You can go ahead and give us a call, 585-219-8889, 585-219-8889. We are live here for you on Saturday, April 6th. You can also email us, radioeod@gmail.com. Guess what? We're also on Twitter @radioeod and Facebook, you guessed it, Radio EOD. All of our past episodes can also be found on YouTube by searching for the Evidence of Design YouTube channel. There are 49 up there for you now, so if you ever want to binge listen to something, is that a thing, binge listening?
I'm sure it is.
Not our show.
You want to become the first binge listener, you can do that on YouTube, Evidence of Design. So what are we talking about today? We are going to be talking about controversial issues. We've done it in the past. We've approached various controversial issues before from an educational lens. How should teachers teach about controversial issues? How do they construct them? How do students come to interpret them and create their own opinions and stances on them? Well, Mary, Matt, and I will be debating some controversial issues going on, mainly related to foreign policy. We're going to start out our discussion by talking about Venezuela. 2 weeks ago, we had a full episode on Venezuela talking about the ongoing crisis there. We didn't really get to, though, what things we can do as a country in Venezuela. So we will get to that today. We'll also talk about U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, and then turning our attention domestically. What sorts of things can we do, especially as 2020 is nearing? What stances should we take on controversial issues to make our society a place that we want to live? Did I get that right, Matt?
That sounds good to me.
Excellent. So again, listeners, many ways you can participate. 585-219-8889, email radioeod@gmail.com, or anything else. Our handle is Radio EOD. Let's take it away.
That was the band Women with the song Shaking Hand.
And so now, folks, thanks for tuning in to Evidence of Design. Let's talk about some controversial issues, particularly Venezuela. We had a whole episode on Venezuela 2 weeks ago. There's a lot going on there. Matt, can you remind me and listeners what is going on in Venezuela that really that's really worth calling what's going on there a crisis? What is the crisis in Venezuela right now?
So the crisis that is happening in Venezuela is that basically the economy has collapsed. Starting in 2013, but really sort of taking off in 2014, oil prices began to fall, and Venezuela is a country that is entirely dependent on its oil market because it has the largest oil deposits in the world, even larger than Saudi Arabia. When the oil prices started to fall because of things like U.S. fracking and stagnating of the global market, Venezuela suffered very badly. And it's sort of been struggling ever since with the highest inflation rates in the world, and which has led to it becoming very difficult for Venezuelan citizens to afford simple things like medicine, access to healthcare, even food, because Venezuela imports so much of its basic goods and needs. These resources that we take for granted here in America have become very scarce in Venezuela, and so there have been reports of people over the past 6 years who have lost, on average, the average Venezuelan citizen has lost about 20 pounds, for example. And as this economic crisis has worsened, the country's president, Nicolas Maduro, has sort of tightened his grip on the federal government. He has consolidated his power. He has done things like undermine the legislative body of the Venezuelan government after it was taken over by a 2/3 majority by the opposition party. He has replaced the justices on the Supreme Court of Venezuela who have not supported him with people who do support him. He has created an entirely new legislative body made up entirely of party loyalists. And as this has sort of gone on, the United States in particular, but also other members of the international community, such as the Lima Group, which is a group of 14 South American countries sort of sort of dedicated to the restoration of democracy in Venezuela, have sort of come out, spoken against him, taken measures. The U.S. has done things like, first of all, they've sanctioned a lot of individuals in Maduro's inner circle, but more recently they've ramped that up to sanction things like the state-owned petrol company, the state-owned gold mining sector. And the end result is that a lot of people are suffering in Venezuela. We've seen something like 3.4 million people leave or try to leave the country over the last 6 years, and this is in a country of 30 million people. So 10% of the population is trying to flee these conditions. And it seems like for the time being, it's only getting worse. Just last month, at the start of March, there was a 5 or 6 day blackout where the entire country was without power, or at least most of it.
Yeah, that's a really great rendition of what's going on in Venezuela. The history is long. To put some more numbers behind that, Matt, oil accounts for 95% of Venezuela's exports and around 25 to 50% of their GDP. So you're mentioning that Venezuela is undergoing an economic crisis. As oil prices have fallen, Venezuela has really been hit hard by that. Their GDP, their gross domestic product, the sort of sum of all of the goods and services produced in a country in a given year, fell by 17% in 2017. That was the third lowest GDP in the world, right behind the Gaza Strip and Syria, which is, of course, undergoing a civil war. And as you mentioned, Matt, the inflation rate in Venezuela in 2018 was 80,000%, meaning basic currency is meaningless, essentially. You can't really go to the store and buy things with the currency because it just doesn't have purchasing power.
Yeah. It's also assuming there's things in the store to be purchased.
Right.
What we're seeing are reports of people who are trying to leave Venezuela, and once they get to the border, often the Colombian border, they can't even afford a bus ticket because the currency is so devalued.
Mm-hmm. And so what people do is just, if they choose to leave, as you said, like 1 out of every 30 Venezuelans has fled the country, and if people do choose to leave, then what they do is just walk. And they walk out of the country and they try to walk where they need to go and do what they can to survive. And so things are quite dire in Venezuela on many accounts. But what has the U.S.'s response to Venezuela been? So we're talking right now about a country that seems very far away. It's in South America. Sure, it used to be South America's most wealthy and powerful countries, and now it's really undergoing a lot of straits. First of all, Matt or Mary, the question is, why should we as Americans care? And second of all, what has been the position of our government to Venezuela?
Well, I mentioned earlier that the U.S. government has introduced a lot of sanctions to sort of pressure Maduro to step aside, to abdicate his position. And part of this is due to the fact that, due to his more authoritarian policies, such as I mentioned earlier, undermining the legislative body of the Venezuelan government, but also because the last election that Venezuela had held back in 2018 was widely condemned by both members of the international community and people inside Venezuela for being just for show, essentially. We had reports of people being sort of persuaded or pressured to vote for Maduro. There were reports just this past week of a New York Times journalist who was recently deported from Venezuela who said that there were doctors who were encouraged to go around to more impoverished homes, people who might have trouble getting access to things like medicine, and provide them with medicine, and in the process of doing so, to remind them that it was Maduro who was providing this for them. That's just one example. There were more sort of like. There's also the fact that the most popular members of the opposition, the people who could have actually posed a genuine threat to Maduro getting reelected, were barred from participating in the election entirely. So it's been widely criticized and condemned by almost everyone in the international community. There's of course differences in opinion in what should happen next. Should Venezuela have another election? Should Maduro be allowed to run? That remains to find a consensus among members of the international community.
Mary, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, one of the questions you asked, I guess, was why should the U.S. be interested in what's going on in Venezuela? And I think one thing that we talked about a couple weeks ago was the fact that with Venezuela's main export being oil, the U.S. has had a great deal to do with, keeping that one of their main exports, because we've been one of the largest consumers of that. And so I think that there is some level of responsibility that needs to be seen by the U.S. in that if we're putting sanctions on oil, or if we're choosing a certain, in any choice that we make with foreign intervention in Venezuela, there is some kind of previous responsibility that we've had in the level of poverty that's happening currently.
I think also just this past week, I don't know if this is something that will actually happen because it's always hard to tell what the president means when he says things, but Trump has announced that he's cutting entirely programs that send aid to Latin American countries. I believe the reports say it's something like we send $600 million each year to various Latin American countries, and a lot of that money goes to programs that are supposed to cut down on gang violence. Mm-hmm. And so you have, while all of this is going on, you have President Trump saying things like, we need to stamp out socialism in Venezuela because it has just bankrupted the country. At the same time, we're going to stop sending in aid to these countries. And we have a caller.
Yes. Thank you, Matt and Mary. We'll reinterpret what you're saying in a second, but we do have a caller. Hello, you are on the air. Try it one more time. Hello, you're on the air.
Hi, yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. This is Aaron from Queens. Just calling because I had some thoughts on this subject, and I just wanted us to be very clear-eyed about what exactly is going on here and what the U.S. interest is and has been in Latin America since forever. So first of all, the idea that Venezuela is somehow more special or more different or worse than any other of the dictatorial or strong-armed regimes in the world is just silly. Saudi Arabia is one of America's strongest allies in the Middle East. Trump famously refused to condemn the king of Saudi Arabia, whatever his name is, for his participation in obvious murder of Jamal Khashoggi. Trump's famously buddies with Putin and Kim Jong-un of North Korea. And these are people, both Saudi Arabia, Russia, North Korea, that are just way worse than Venezuela. Juan Guaido, the leader of the opposition in Venezuela, has not, what would a true dictator do? He would just kill him, take him out, put him in prison or whatever. Juan Guaido has been allowed to travel to Colombia to try to rouse up support from the CIA there and to start a coup back in Venezuela. He's been to return to Caracas. He's been allowed to pretty much do whatever he wants. I don't like Maduro. I don't think he's a very good guy, but it's ridiculous for us to focus so much on Venezuela when there are so many worse dictators in the world, and especially ones that the U.S. actively supports, like Saudi Arabia. And just an excellent example, I think, of what's going on, why it's ridiculous and completely cynical and really misguided, the U.S. current participation in whatever is going on in Venezuela, is who Trump appointed to be the U.S. envoy to Venezuela, a guy by the name of Elliot Abrams, who basically was responsible for every major U.S. human rights atrocity in Latin America for the past 30 years, starting under the Reagan administration. I'm just reading this list off Wikipedia right now. But Elliot Abrams, who is our current U.S. Special Envoy to Venezuela, participated in the mass murder and torture of indigenous people genocide in Guatemala under then-dictator Efrain Rios Montt. And he, not obviously in person, but he supported and sent weapons and aid and money to that dictator. In El Salvador, there was the El Mozote massacre of hundreds of civilians in the military by El Salvador military. And when the reports began appearing in the U.S. media, Abrams told the Senate committee that the reported number of deaths in El Mozote was not credible. That was over 1,000 people that were killed by the Salvadoran army and under the directions of the U.S.-backed dictator at the time. Nicaragua, he was involved in the Iran-Contra situation. He supported the Contra's efforts to overthrow the democratically elected Sandinista government in Nicaragua. So basically, this guy is horrible. He's a piece of crap. And every time he's gotten his hands on Latin America, it's been entirely to further U.S. dictators and strongmen and to basically push human rights abuses to try to put these populations in line. So I completely understand Maduro's terror, and especially the people of Venezuela's terror when they hear the U.S. is getting involved, and when they hear this monster Elliot Abrams is going to have his hands on the situation. I don't know what we should do about Venezuela. I don't particularly think Maduro is a good leader, but the idea that the U.S. should somehow be involved, it's just, when have we ever done any good regime change in Latin America? All the U.S. has ever done, from the tip of South America all the way up to Mexico, has been brutal support of dictators and fascists and people who will commit terrorism against their own people purely for U.S. alliance. You know what the U.S. should do about Venezuela? Nothing. Just let them sort it out. We'll only make it worse. Thank you very much.
Oh, Aaron, hang on the line there. Don't hang up yet. Mary, Matt, do you have any responses to Aaron? He's saying, look, the U.S. has a long history of bad things in Venezuela. The U.S. supports a lot of other dictatorial and authoritarian regimes around the world. The U.S. shouldn't do anything. Any responses, Mary or Matt?
I guess my question is not related to what the country could do in Venezuela itself. Is I think if we're thinking about sanctions, those are not, hands-on in Venezuela. That's something about Venezuelan product in the United States. Like, what are your feelings on that?
Why are we sanctioning Venezuela? We don't sanction Saudi Arabian oil, a far worse dictatorial regime that literally kills gay people, stones them to death, and literally burns witches and gives no rights to women, doesn't even allow them to drive or leave the house without their husband's consent. We love Saudi Arabian oil. We're the U.S.'s biggest ally in the region other than Israel. So here's why the U.S. put sanctions on Venezuela. It wasn't for good-hearted human rights reasons. It wasn't because Maduro was a mean guy. It was pure and simple because Maduro was not allied with the United States. And the United States, under the you guys hopefully can remind me of this, it was either the Truman Doctrine or the Marshall Plan. One of them said that basically the Americas is the U.S. land, and any country that tries to, get involved with that is not acceptable.
Yeah, it was the 1823 Monroe Doctrine, I think.
Yeah, the Monroe Doctrine, yes, thank you. It's because Venezuela was not allied with the U.S., because Chavez was critical of U.S. foreign policy, rightly so, and Maduro continued that tradition and chose not to ally with the U.S., and the U.S. punished them for that. If Maduro was an even worse, much more brutal dictator, which probably the U.S. would prefer, but allied with the U.S., there would have been no sanctions. The oil would have kept flowing, the money would have kept flowing to Venezuelan people in power, whatever they do with it there in their corrupt little kingdom. But it's not for humanitarian purposes. It's absolutely clear.
So, Aaron, hang on still. Listeners, this is 100.9 FM WXAR in Rochester. You're listening to Evidence of Design. We're talking about what should the U.S. do in Venezuela, if anything, given the ongoing crisis there. We have a caller, Aaron, who's saying, look, the U.S. shouldn't do much, especially given its record of supporting, poor regime change and authoritarianism and just bad things for the people who live in South America. Matt, do you have a response?
I know what the U.S. should do. The U.S. should lift the sanctions, let them be a normal country like every other normal country, get to trade whatever they want. Hopefully that will start improving the Venezuelan economy and help get the money flowing to the Venezuelan people or whatever they need, and then support the international community with whatever pressures through the UN or local, multinational blocs that they want to do to try to pressure Maduro to be a bit of a nicer guy. But other than that, nothing. Lift the sanctions and get involved in some international diplomacy. That's it. Anything more we do than that will only make the situation worse for the Venezuelan people.
All right, Aaron, thanks a lot for your call.
Yes, thank you very much. Have an excellent day.
Yeah, you too. Matt, what do you have to say to Aaron?
I don't really disagree with anything that Aaron said. This is sort of a question that I've been grappling with ever since I started following the crisis in Venezuela, which is what should the U.S. response be? And Aaron is absolutely right when he says that the U.S.'s track record in Latin America is deplorable. Mm-hmm. That just about every single time that I can think of that we've gotten involved, we've only set up brutal dictators who only because that the U.S. was able to sort of get something out of them. And further to his point that Trump's interest in Venezuela is not humanitarian. I mean, absolutely not. I think I said as much on the show. Trump's interest in this is as Aaron said. He's only interested in it because Venezuela is not allied with the U.S. because Venezuela has these oil deposits because it's entirely out of self-interest, at least from the standpoint of the Trump administration. The question and that's sort of what we've seen a lot on the progressive left, is people saying we need to stay out of Venezuela because of this horrible track record that we have, because the Trump administration doesn't have the Venezuelan people's best interests at heart. They're acting in bad faith. At the same time, I don't think that the response is to do nothing. I mean, we have stories of people who are starving, and that doesn't seem like something that should be allowed. I don't think that the U.S. should be pushing for a coup, as they seem to be doing. I don't think that they should be... I don't have the answer, but I think what should be prioritized right now is getting aid to the Venezuelan people to make sure that there aren't people who are starving to death or are dying in their hospital beds because there's no electricity in the country. I think these people are being left behind to some extent, and this is not something that anybody should be comfortable with, and that we need to do something if we're able to in order to help alleviate that.
I mean, I guess we could think for a minute about what potential interventions could look like, just to sort of, throw some ideas around. I was trying to brainstorm this earlier, and I was just like, okay, if the U.S. is going to be hands-on in Venezuela, like what might it include? It might, as you're mentioning, just be humanitarian aid. Some other things would be like a coup that we would be, or the U.S. would be supporting one side to overthrow a current government, or we could have on-land military intervention, and those are very different options.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. So there's there's foreign policy tools the United States can use. They could just use military intervention as has been done in nations like Grenada and, of course, many other Latin American countries. The U.S. could also use economic pressures and sanctions, which they're doing right now. Just this week, in addition to the sanctions that are already on Venezuela, the Trump administration announced that they would put sanctions on Venezuelan oil trading ships that sell and bring oil to Cuba, which is one of Venezuela's strongest partners. And these ships come from the Venezuelan state-owned oil company PDVSA. And so the Trump administration is continuing with economic pressures to tighten the noose, so to speak, around Maduro. So we're already doing economic sanctions. We are, seems like, flirting with the idea of a coup d'etat or regime change through the use of the intelligence agencies like the CIA, who there's been reports that the Venezuelan military leaders have met with intelligence officers from the U.S. to try to think about the possibility of the military instituting a coup d'etat, which Latin America and South America has a fairly strong history in military rule or co-rule with the military and the government. And I'm not saying that's good or bad. It has a long history with the strong military rule from the U.S.'s involvement. So we're flirting with that idea as well. Or I think Aaron was suggesting that we just, you can just go the entire diplomatic route and go through international institutions like the United Nations and try to promote a new election or just some guarantee from the international community that supports a better outcome for the people in Venezuela.
I mean, I think we know how Trump feels about the UN, so.
Right, and that's the issue. I would counter, though, if I'm going to play devil's advocate or even counter. So Aaron was mentioning that, the U.S. supports other authoritarian regimes around the world, such as with Saudi Arabia, such as with North Korea, and, of course, Trump's very odd relationship with Vladimir Putin, which is not exonerated because of the Mueller report, which we haven't talked about on the show yet. There's still something very odd going on there. The thing I see that's a distinction, though, is that Venezuela used to be a democracy, and the problem now is that Maduro seems to be strengthening power to turn Venezuela into an authoritarian dictatorship. And so the problem I have is Saudi Arabia is a kingdom. It's not a democracy. And so that's just the way it is in Saudi Arabia. And so it's the way it is in North Korea. And so to institute regime change there is very different because you'd be fundamentally changing the governments. Whereas in Venezuela, I think the problem is it's like the U.S. has to say, wait a second, no. We can't let a democratic nation go in South America, very close to our country. We can't let authoritarianism spread. That's a distinction I see, though.
I don't know that Trump is concerned about that sort of thing. I think that is something that he has seized upon in order to further his own narrative.
I agree. Yeah, so it's interesting when you talk about international relations or foreign policy where you make nation states, you make countries into actors. Like, what would the United States think? You say that all the time, and it's like, who's the United States? Am I the United States as an American citizen? Is Trump the United States as the head of the executive branch? And so let me just put it out there. I think we all agree, perhaps not, feel free to call me out. Trump doesn't care at all about the people of Venezuela. In fact, my personal opinion is that Trump wants the Venezuelan crisis to be worse. That's why he's stopping money from going to Latin America, because Trump wants a refugee crisis so that he can build his border wall. I'm not saying Trump is doing all of this just so he can have his wall, but it's in Trump's interests to create anguish on the southern border so he can prove to people this is why we need to strengthen power, invest more in the military, give more executive power to the president, and so I can have my wall. Trump doesn't care anything at all about the people of Venezuela or the humanitarian crisis that is going on there. In fact, I think he doesn't care if it gets worse. That's my opinion. And so what Trump thinks is different than what I would say is the U.S.'s interest. And I don't know who I'm speaking to when I say to the U.S. I guess I mean everyone, us as a part of a society. I think it is in our interest, or it is in the interest of the U.S. to see democracy spread. Period. I don't care who's in office. I think that it should be the U.S.'s policy to see democracy spread. And that has been the U.S.'s ostensible role for a long time. Of course, it's often the United States promotes freedom and democracy while under the, that's the guise.
While undermining freedom and democracy.
While undermining, exactly.
Especially in Latin America.
Yeah, and so I'm not discounting or throwing away any of those horrible past histories, because oftentimes I think the U.S. uses freedom and democracy just to promote economic imperialism.
Yeah, to get its way.
Right.
But what you're saying is that we should aspire to be as good as we've claimed to have been.
Yeah, I think the U.S. should promote democracy around the world. That's what we should do. We should actively take a strong hand in promoting democracy, because I think democracy is good and important, and democracy should be, at least nominally, the fundamental principle through which this country is based upon. And so I think that we have a stake in promoting democracy in Venezuela. Of course, it's very hard to promote democracy when you institute a military coup d'etat, but I think somehow it should be in our interest to promote democracy. But that is also very interesting, and a well point by Aaron about the U.S.'s support of other authoritarian regimes in many, many, many instances around the globe.
Well, yeah, I agree.
And so, listeners, you are listening to 100.9 FM WXIR in Rochester. We are talking about Venezuela so far today. I'm sorry, Matt, what was that? We are talking about Venezuela today, and so we would like also to continue this discussion, though, and hear your input on the matter. 585-219-8889, 585-219-8889. We are in this studio for you to share your opinion. What's going on in Venezuela? What should we do, if anything? Do we have a responsibility to do something in Venezuela, or laissez-faire, let it be? Mary, is that the correct French pronunciation of laissez-faire?
It's close enough.
Laissez-faire. Laissez-faire. Not to make fun. I got Gilets jaunes down pat, though. Everyone out there, Gilets jaunes. Give it a shot.
Is that protest still going on?
Yeah, it is. It's cut down by like 10%, but a lot less people. But yeah, it's interesting.
Cut down by 10% or to 10%?
10% of the original membership is still protesting. I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
So not that much.
Yeah, but still, I mean, there are people out there fighting for change against neoliberal policies.
And Emmanuel Macron.
I want to add one more layer and nuance to our discussion about Venezuela, though, and this is something I'm actually seriously concerned about.
Okay.
So, March 29th, just last week, our national security advisor, Mr. John Bolton, one of the best mustaches in government, he came out and...
Jason's a fan, apparently.
Of his mustache, not his policies. He came out... He came out with a...
Is there a John Bolton mustache fan club? Let me get on the mailing list.
There is now.
I'm on it. I'm trying to
the only member.
do mine. As the only person with a mustache in the studio right now, I am...
I got something going.
I don't.
I just need to shave. Anyway, this
radio
conversation has been horribly derailed by... Anyway, go on. What did John Bolton say, Jason?
John Bolton,
under his mustache,
and under his bushy mustache, said, "quote: We strongly caution actors external to the Western Hemisphere against deploying military assets to Venezuela or elsewhere in the hemisphere with the intent of establishing or expanding military operations. We will consider such provocative actions as a direct threat to international peace and security in the region, and we will continue to defend and protect the interests of the United States and those of our partners in the Western Hemisphere, which are rooted in a shared respect for liberty, security, and the rule of law." Why did John Bolton come out with that statement on March 29th? Because on March 23rd, it's reported that two Russian planes landed in Caracas, the capital of Venezuela, and 100 Russian soldiers got off those planes, ostensibly to help fix S-300 air defense missile systems in Venezuela. So Venezuela has long time bought a lot of military equipment from Russia. And of course, it's Russia that is supporting the Maduro regime. And here we have it. Apparently, Russian soldiers have landed in Venezuela under the guise of, fixing these air defense systems. And they say they're fixing them because they were damaged in all of the blackouts that have been going on through Venezuela. So the upper echelons of the U.S. administration, John Bolton, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, and hard to say Trump, because who knows what Trump stands for besides not standing for anything that's good for humanity. Just kidding. So, they came out and said a lot of things that are wary against Russia.
I missed
interested that he just said liberty, security, rule of law, and didn't mention democracy, actually.
Yeah, I don't know. I wonder if there are scholars of language who looks at government policies and studies that. I don't know whether or not democracy is invoked often, but liberty definitely I would say is, and rule of law, and that is interesting though too. I would hope democracy, but Matt, you were going to mention something.
I just was saying that I had missed that. I didn't know that Russian planes had landed in Venezuela.
Yeah, and so the worry from some, and I think I would include myself in the category, is whether or not Venezuela will become another Syria, which is where there are bad things happening domestically in a foreign country. The U.S. has to question, to what extent do we get involved? Of course, in Syria, where there's been a long, ongoing civil war ever since the Arab Spring revolutions in 2011, President Obama famously came out, or infamously had a red line saying, look, if the regime of the president of Syria, Bashar al-Assad, if Syria uses chemical weapons, that is a red line and the U.S. must get involved in some way. Of course, it came out that the Syrian government was using chemical weapons against its own people. The U.S. did not get involved, and a lot of people in the international community, especially, domestically, even the Conservative Party, really went against Obama on this and said, look, you're looking weak. You didn't stick with your word, and now there's a lot of problems going on in Syria. The U.S. eventually did, of course, get involved. We still have around 2,000 troops in Syria, which President Trump has announced that we would pull all of them out. But more importantly, Russia started to get involved in the conflict, and it became kind of a proxy Cold War effect, where it was the U.S. supporting Kurdish militants and also, Kurdish fighters, yes, Kurdish fighters and also other rebel groups against the Assad regime, and it was Russia supporting the Assad regime, and then you of course had Turkey involved, and so it became and still is this horrible humanitarian crisis that was a proxy for two superpowers, U.S. versus Russia.
I just want to mention real quick, Trump's been kind of weird on Syria in that he has promised to pull troops out of it, but I think he has also increased the number of airstrikes on the country. I don't know if you can back me up on that, Jason.
I'm not sure.
Like drone strikes?
Drone and I think also planes.
And so the worry I have is whether or not Venezuela will become another proxy for the Cold War, this time in the Western Hemisphere, though. I'm getting another message from a listener. It might be, it is Aaron from Queens here, who's saying the difference is Syria was and still is in a civil war. Venezuela is not. The only threat of a civil war in Venezuela is the one the U.S. is trying to start by supporting Juan Guaido. Oh, shots fired. That is a big difference. And the problem I would counter though and say, like, there's been so much domestic strife in Venezuela and a collapse of the rule of law and whatnot that a civil war might start anyways. I'm not sure.
One thing that I think might be interesting to go into is, like, when we're talking about the extremely high rate of inflation in Venezuela, like, historically, extremely high inflation has occasionally, or, has sometimes led to war as a way to bolster the economy. And I do wonder if that's something that's being pushed for. I don't know by whom necessarily, but it is something to consider, I think. Like, especially looking at Germany in the early 1900s, it was inflation and poverty and people in dire situations that led to a war, again, as a way to bolster the German economy.
Mm-hmm. Who would Venezuela go to war against, though, Mary?
I don't know.
They'd have to invent some enemy. Yeah, I don't know Venezuela's relations with its neighboring countries like Colombia. From what I understand, they must be very close. From reports I've read, Colombia used to go through a lot of strife, and Venezuela took in a lot of Colombian refugees, and now it's vice versa.
So it's reversed.
I would imagine that the governments it's very tense. It's a lot like what's going on in Myanmar and Burma with the Rohingya and the ethnic cleansing and genocide that's been going on there. It's a lot like what's going on in Syria and the Middle East and Europe and all the tension, the rise of white nationalism you see in Europe. And so the problems is where you have domestic conflict that causes a lot of people to leave their countries in search of better homes. things start to go bad. And I think we're really struggling with that as a world right now, as a globe. And that really causes white nationalism and ethno-nationalism to arise. What do you think, Matt?
I don't know that Venezuela going to war doesn't seem like something that would be in Venezuela's interest. I don't think that Maduro would try to engineer anything like that. Even a civil war seems like you would stand to lose much more than anything you could gain from like fixing inflation. That's not to say that I'm right. I don't know.
I don't know either. I just thought it would be an interesting thing to
consider,
think about.
Yeah.
Because like, I mean, how else are they going to, I guess what other options are there to fix inflation?
I'm not an expert on economic policy by any means, but a lot of people seem to have suggested, from what I've read, that one of the things that Maduro should be trying to do, if he's serious about sort of fixing Venezuela's economic crisis, is to wean the country off its dependence on oil. Obviously, it can't totally eliminate that because it's such a big part of the market, but perhaps not being so dependent on, other countries on imports for things like food and medicine. I mean, Venezuela is a fairly large country in relative terms, I think, and they do have farmland that they could be putting to use. I think. Yeah.
Sure. And so, listeners, you are listening to 100.9 FM WXIR in Rochester. We're talking about Venezuela today and what the U.S.'s response should be in Venezuela and what we all should do. Do we care about what's happening in Venezuela? Why should we care, if at all? And what is our responsibility in Venezuela, if at all? You're welcome to participate in a number of ways. 585-219-8889, 585-219-8889. We are live for you in the studio on Saturday, April 6th, 2019. You can also give us an email, radioeod@gmail.com. So I would like to pivot a little bit and
shift gears?
What's up?
We're going to shift gears?
Not entirely. We'll stay on Venezuela.
Take a quick break and come back?
We can, I think, just continue our conversation here because we are still going to rage on for a little bit with our remaining about 12 minutes.
Okay.
And so I would like to switch gears a little bit and talk perhaps more broadly or theoretically about what the future of the 21st century looks like. A very easy discussion.
Sure.
No one should feel ashamed or like they're interrupting anything at all if they want to call in. If you want to call in about anything.
I brought my tea leaves.
The state of John Bolton's mustache. If you want to talk about, anything we talk about in Venezuela, 585-219-8889. Don't worry about interrupting us.
Or you can email us at
radioeod@gmail.com. Yep.
And I'm on the Facebook page right now if you want to give us a message.
Radio EOD. It's always awkward with live radio to feel like you're interrupting, but listeners, we're here for you, so you take precedence over what we are saying. So switching gears a little bit, this was the 70th anniversary of NATO. I think it was yesterday. Or at least the end of this week. So NATO, of course, is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It was signed right after the end of World War II in 1949. And the whole idea behind NATO is that you'd have all these Western countries that at least share the same principles and values would band together to prevent armed conflict from breaking out again like the ones seen in World War II. And so NATO has been a staple, a mainstay of the international reality, the international institutions, since it was signed. Most people associate NATO with what's known as its Article 5. That is the collective defense provision in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And that basically says an attack on any one nation in NATO is an attack on all of the nations in NATO.
Isn't that sort of how about both world wars started?
Yeah, it was how World War I famously started. I think that's what you learn in history class, is that you get entrenched military alliances, and if you attack one, everyone else has got to get in, and you start a brawl. But, that is subject to debate, Matt. There's something out there called the democratic peace theory, and the idea is that democracies don't fight each other. And so that the only people who would attack NATO are people who aren't democracies. And so you should become democracies, join NATO, and that's how we'll get world peace eventually one day. That's kind of one way of looking at it. The other theory is just like, you know how we get peace? You get peace through strength. You get a lot of weapons, you get a lot of nuclear missiles, and you say, the more weapons you have, no one's punching me, because we're going to punch you back harder. And that's what you typically see, Otto von Bismarck in Germany, Ronald Reagan, Donald Trump. Typically the right of the political spectrum kind of believes in peace through strength.
Yeah, and that's a very particular kind of peace. You call it peace through strength. I would call it peace through fear.
Right. But some people would say, if we want to get back to talking about ideology, some people would say that's just how the world works, Mary. Like, the world is a nasty, what is it? Humanity is nasty. Life is nasty, brutish, and short, Thomas Hobbes. And so the reality that we live in is just like, there's going to be violence and power everywhere.
What'd you say, Matt?
So it's like my mornings. Nasty, brutish, and short.
Fair enough. So it's also known as realpolitik, realism, or pragmatism. Those words are kind of used to invoke the idea that, like, look, there's always going to be conflict, and how you get what you want is by being strong.
I guess there is a difference, like you mentioned, realpolitik, and there is importance in looking at how the world is functioning currently, but I think it's also important to look at how we want the world to work as current actors, in like being alive. We should recognize and believe that we have some say in how the world will function. And while it's important to say, okay, right now there's all this violence, we should also, be forward thinking and look at how do we want peace to look like? Like, do we want it to be peace out of fear? I don't.
Mm-hmm. Well, what does the future of peace look like in the 21st century? In my opinion, it's not looking so great right now. There's been a resurgence in nationalism, meaning sort of a feeling of pride and superiority over one's own country or nation state. So there's a resurgence in nationalism. There's a resurgence in ethno-nationalism, like the idea that you are bonded.
Ethnic groups are, as you said,
right,
bonded by their ethnic identity.
Right, by people who look like you, sound like you, talk like you, have the same culture as you. So there's a resurgence in a lot of that. And you could argue very wide-sweeping, this is horrible historical reductionism, I understand, but you could argue that in the Western hegemonic lens, the 20th century, the 1900s, was really characterized by the conflict between capitalism and socialism. That is horrible historical reductionism.
Yeah, that's very sweeping.
Very sweeping. And then looking forward at the 21st century, you could argue that it's looking like the entire world is capitalist now, essentially, and we're basically looking at democratic capitalism versus authoritarian capitalism. I would say authoritarian capitalism is kind of like Russia and China. Of course, they're not entirely capitalist. There are state-owned industries, but they're very much market-based, integrated into the global economy, using these terms loosely and fluidly. And then you have more of a U.S. side, which is more democratic. And so the struggle is, what is the future of the world looking like? Matt, you're shrugging and looking like this is the worst conversation ever. What are you thinking?
I don't know.
No, what do you think?
That's why he's shrugging.
I'm not sure how to say this. I don't think that a democracy can exist when the sort of the balance of power is so favorably shifted towards the people with wealth. And I think that's what we're seeing more and more of in the U.S. today. So I don't know that I would. I mean, I'm not going to say that the U.S. isn't a democracy anymore. I think that's too extreme of a position to take. But it's starting to lean away from that, in my opinion.
Right. That's the point I'm making.
I think if we're looking at, democracy as a word in itself can have a lot of different meanings. Like, we've talked on this show about democratic capitalism. We've also talked about democratic socialism, but both of those would fall under quote unquote democracy. So to some extent, yes, like the US is still a democracy. We still have open elections. On the other hand, like you said, we are going farther and farther away from that because there are restrictions to who can vote. There are restrictions on how people are able to vote. Obviously, last week we talked about H.R. 1, which would be a way to make the United States even more of a democratic nation by increasing access to the polls and increasing who has a voice in elections. But if we are continuing on the road we're on right now, I guess inequality or wealth inequality is only going to increase.
I agree.
When we're looking at healthcare and education, which are all extremely expensive, only wealthy people are able to thrive, and everyone else just kind of is there.
And herein we get to the point of our show and the point I was hoping to make, where the future of the 21st century seems to be, to what extent can our societies be egalitarian, both economically and politically? Income and wealth inequality is very rampant across the globe due to the fact that all countries now participate in a global economic system, and the various ways that multinational corporations and capital and finance and this and that flows across borders allows some people to have a lot more power than others.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And you see this regardless of what nation you're talking about, the United States, Russia, all across the globe.
Absolutely.
And so the question is, to what extent can we erect institutions and values that support both democratic participation, not just in the economy, because that has been the argument for so long for the past 40 years, where democracy has just become your ability to participate in the market, meaning to buy and sell goods, the freedom to choose. And so the problem is
freedom to buy everybody out.
Exactly. The freedom to be a consumer. So to what extent can we construct institutions that actually are democratic in terms of your politics and inclusive in terms of your needs as a human being through healthcare and education and all of those things, not to mention the climate change.
So that we could make people active members of society, not just of a market.
Exactly. Active members of a society than a market. Right. And so I'm wondering, that's how I view what's going on in Venezuela and other foreign involvement. I'm just trying to wonder, to what extent can we promote our values? Because I think we should promote values of democracy and liberalism in terms of equality. I know I'm throwing around a lot of terms. To what extent we promote those things that we should stand for and at least ostensibly stand for through this nation. And so all I'm saying, I guess, going back to the Russian involvement thing, is like, I don't know, this is very messy, and I'm glad to be called out on this. I would rather have U.S. involvement than Russian involvement.
In Venezuela?
Just in general. If the U.S., I don't think that foreign involvement is necessarily always a bad thing. If we live in a world where there are nation states, where there's 198 countries in the world, the world is a board game map. The world is a game of Risk to some extent, and that's just how the world works. And I'm not saying that's great, but the point is that countries are constructed that way. And so you're going to have countries that have more power than others and can exert influence over others. And so if you're going to do that, with great power comes great responsibility. The U.S. should somehow use its power responsibly to promote democracy and liberalism.
I would also argue that we need to promote that fully within our own nation as well.
I agree.
I think that's the fundamental issue that I sort of have with all of it, is that, you know, the U.S. has tried to promote democracy and freedom ostensibly throughout its history. But what does that always look like? Oftentimes it's Bay of Pigs, it's Allende, it's always in pursuit of its own interests. And the history of the United States does not hold up to the values that it promotes. And if it wants to take that role, if you think it should take that role as an influencer in the wider community, as it has for much of its history, then it needs to be better, and it needs to be better here, especially because it doesn't live up to those values, in my opinion.
Those are perhaps great closing words on this topic of talking about really messy. What do we do in Venezuela? We purposely wanted to go somewhere that's really messy, where there's no clear answer. Thanks for going along the ride for us, folks. Thanks, Aaron from Queens, for calling in. If you are wondering what can we take action on, go ahead and listen to our last week's episode 49 of Evidence of Design and 100.9 FM WXAR. We talked about what you just mentioned, Mary. H.R. 1, the For the People Act of 2019, is proposed by the democratically controlled House of Representatives that attempts to sort of modernize or change a lot of our institutions like campaign, finance, like voting, like ethics in government. It proposes a lot of change to those things to, well, try to make it more democratic. And so if you're looking for some things to support or research, that is a great place to look into. As a reminder, none of the Republican members of the House who surround Monroe County voted for it. I believe Joe Morelli did, and so that's something to think about. We can, for our last few moments, just remind that the City of Rochester's clean sweep is coming up. For those, we're doing the hardest pivot of our show here, going from talking about foreign Venezuela to City of Rochester Clean Sweep. But for those who don't know, Clean Sweep is a citywide day of service. I believe it is Saturday, May 11th this year. And what happens is you can sign up online. Just Google sort of City of Rochester Clean Sweep. You can sign up, choose a number of sites to serve at, and then you can go
pick up trash.
Yeah, you can
at the
pick
parks.
up. This is not Pick Up the Parks Day. That's a different thing. But a lot of clean sweep sites do entail picking up trash in parks. But there's a number of things also going on that you can do. So look for organizations you want to help out with. And also you get a free T-shirt, you get a free lunch, and you get to see a free Red Wings game after the service. So City of Rochester Clean Sweep, Saturday, May 11th. Something to think about. Any closing words, Matt or Mary? Anything else to promote or plug?
Not today.
I have no opinions.
All right. We'll close it out with a song then here at 100.9 FM WXAR in Rochester, New York. Thanks a lot for being here, everyone. Be well. Be safe. We'll be back next week. And bye-bye.